What is up, Wolang Clan? It's good to see y'all out here today in this beautiful Friday. Now today I wanted to ask you, what are you doing to celebrate the weekend coming up? Because it's going to be a nice one where I'm at least. And B, tell me, what are you talking to your colleagues about for the fall when it comes to your curriculum? Because I have something really fun for you today. We're going to play a little bit of a game to see if your curriculum is on the right path for what's coming up your way in the fall. So you're going to see below, in the link below, like right there. It says the World Language Teacher Toolkit. Jump on in and grab that link. You can go to lalibrelanguagelearning.com/toolkit to get it as well. I'm going to show you some things that are in it today while we play this little game. And so if you want all the information that we're going to talk about today, just go on in and grab that toolkit because it's free and it's going to help you. What we're going to talk about today is one of my favorite subjects. And I decided this one because so many people email me about it every day because it's their favorite part of the toolkit. Are you ready for this? It's 5 myths about language learning. We're going to bust it up today. I don't know about you, but we used to watch Mythbusters all the time at school in science class. So we're totally going to do it today. We're going to myth bust some language right now. Are you ready for this? It's going to be awesome. So when you hear what I'm about to say, I want you to tell me whether you think it's true or false. They all have to do with 5 really common myths about language learning, but I'm going to spin it in a way where I don't know if you're going to be able to tell which one's right. Are you ready? Here's the first one, okay? Tell me whether you think it's true or false. We learn language from our parents and from our teachers. What do you think? I'm excited to see what it is. Now, if you're thinking in your head, yeah, that sounds right. You'd be with most people, but it's actually false. We do not learn language from our parents, caregivers, teachers, adults in our life when we are little kids. You know what's funny about that? If that were true, everybody would learn different pieces of language at different times, and we would all kind of come to a different path as we're learning language. Isn't that kind of wild to think about? Like, we all think that the adults in our life teach us language when we are children, but that's actually not how it works. We learn language through this thing called universal grammar. That's a filter in our heads. And the reason that people theorize this to be true, primarily Noam Chomsky, he theorized the idea of universal grammar, but the reason everybody's kind of jumped on that bandwagon in terms of research is because, think about it, if the adults in our life were the reasons that we learn language, we would probably talk exactly like them. Or, even more importantly, some people would not reach the goal of language learning at all. Like, there would be a lot of people walking around in this world who would have a very limited proficiency in their native language if what we heard around us was the source of all of our knowledge. Isn't that kind of crazy to think about? Because that's just not true. When you look at the research of how people learn languages, everybody learns the same pieces of language in a sequential order. But they learn it usually kind of come into different times, but everybody eventually reaches the same bar of proficiency as long as they are like a normally abled language learner, if they've got everything that they need to learn language. And if our adults in our life are responsible for that, then that would just not be the case. And I encourage you to look up more information about this if you're curious or you're like, is she crazy? The truth about it is that you can find a lot more if you look up the words poverty of the stimulus. Poverty of the stimulus is the argument that talks about how if we all learn language from the adults in our lives, and we didn't have some sort of natural language filter, then we would come to very different paths of proficiency. So which one did you think it was? That is myth busted number 1. You ready for number 2? Number 2. Language is a skill, not a subject. What do you think about this one? True or false? True! World language is not an academic subject. It's actually a skill. So when it comes to characterizing what actually happens in world language classes, it's way more like learning a skill, like learning how to make pottery or learning how to run faster. It's not at all comparable to the classes that it's usually filtered in with, like science or math or history, or, just just go ahead and take a little pick from your common course. It's not at all like that. So when your students walk into your classroom, they should feel a noticeable difference. They should be uncomfortable because they're told that it's an academic subject. It's actually not. It's a skill. And the number one reason why this is a true fact about language learning is because think about how you actually acquire skills. It is through input, through messages that we are able to understand, and then learning how to respond to those messages. So some of the tools that we often talk about in a language class, like learning grammar, which is a good thing, but it's not the focus, right? Or learning new words or vocabulary and learning them in lists, not a good thing, even though everybody does it, not a good thing. That's actually not what the class is all about, right? Like the reason that people are there is so that they can learn the essential skill of communication, of being able to interpersonally interact with language learners and of course with native speakers. But that's why it's such a different class and why it comes in such a different form. And that's exciting. Like, I certainly don't want my class to feel like anybody else's class in the building. I want it to be really interactive and feel really different. And so if you ever walk into your class and you're like, I really feel like I'm doing different things, good. You're doing the right thing. Keep doing it. All right. Myth number 3. You ready? Tell me whether you think it's true or false. Myth number 3. This is like one of my favorite ones. Certain languages are harder than others. So depending on like what language you're coming from or what language you're studying or what you're used to, certain languages are harder than others. Tell me, what do you think? Is it true? Is it false? This one is bust wide open. This is false. There is not one language that's harder than another one. Isn't that crazy? That blew my mind when I learned about why this is. But here's the reason why. All languages, technically, if you're starting from nothing, are the same level of difficulty for your brain to learn. Because going back to that same argument, if certain languages were harder than others, people learning their first native language would learn it at very, very different rates of progression. But that's not the case. We find that most people tend to be native speakers of their first home language, their mother tongue, by the time they're about 6 or 7. And it really doesn't vary that much from that. So it is impossible that those languages could be any different level of difficulty. There is a perceived difference in level of difficulty when you're learning your second or maybe your third language, or 4th, 5th, experts out there. However, that's mostly based on writing systems and pronunciation. And that brings me to myth number 4. Well, this is actually like more like a fact because it's like pretty obvious that this is true. Writing systems are not actually part of the language. They're an entirely separate system to speaking a language. Isn't that wild? I never really thought about that because like when you are fluent in a language or when you're learning a language, we usually spend most of the time learning how to write it and how to read it. But technically, a writing system is a completely separate language from the actual language that you're learning. And what I mean by that is like the proficiency in speaking and listening. It's a totally separate system. You know why this is true? Because languages could exist entirely without writing systems. Many of them do. Wild, right? So what I want you to think about, like this myth number 4, that a writing system is a really integral part of a language, is that what are you spending the most of your time on? As soon as I learned that about language, that languages really can exist without at all the support of their writing system, it would be a lot harder, but they could. That really made me think deeply about how much time I spend in my class trying to teach my students how to use the writing system that we're working on, whether it be French or Spanish, because I teach both of those languages. And it kind of threw me for a loop a little bit because I thought to myself, this is a separate writing system from the language. Yes, it's a vehicle of delivery for the language, but at the end of the day, my kids are here to speak. So that's going to be the focus moving here on out. Something to think about too. Let's go back to myth number 2, that language is a skill, not a subject. Why are we doing so much writing? What's the purpose? What do we really want students to get out of that? Because if you ask me, I think we do probably 40% more writing than we actually need to, because we're really, really focused on learning literacy in a student's home language. Of course, an incredible goal. But at the end of the day, our goal as language teachers is to make sure that they gain proficiency and skills in the language that we're teaching. Is writing truly the most effective and most efficient way to get there? In a lot of cases it is, but think about the last writing activity that you did with your students. What was the purpose of that activity? Was the purpose of that activity to move your students forward in proficiency? Or was it because writing is easier to use in class, it's easier to assess, and it's easier for you to correct when it comes to assessments? Because that was like a blow for me, is that I learned that I'm probably doing more writing than I need to, or I'm doing writing for the wrong reasons. So I want you to ask yourself, as you're going over your curriculum and ideas for the next year and your activities, how much of your writing is for the right reasons? Writing is great, but is it always for the right reasons? That's a powerful one for me. Oh, here we go. We got the last one, number 5. Ooh, this is I know I said the other one was my favorite, but this is really my other one. Okay, language errors are bad and we should avoid them. True? False? True, false, true, false, true, false? What do you think? Language errors are bad and we should avoid them. It's false. Language errors are actually an indication of your proficiency level. So it's not that we should be avoiding errors, it's actually that you should be paying attention to the types of errors that your students make, because they are the most valuable pieces of information for you as to where your students are at in terms of proficiency. The other number one thing I want you to remember when it comes to errors and whether you should focus on correcting them or not is that errors are actually a sign of exactly what you want students to do. It is a sign of something called reprocessing in language. In second language acquisition, what happens when students are kind of like on the threshold of a new level of proficiency, or they're learning something and trying to process and acquire, because those are two different things, acquire a new skill that's actually definitely above their level, what the brain does is it takes a chunk, like a functional chunk of language, puts it right here, and as it's moving into the next area and staying there forever so that people can use it, it takes that functional chunk, it breaks it apart like somebody tinkering with an engine and puts it back together, usually in the wrong pieces. And then, after it gets some feedback about the errors, it puts it back together and corrects that error, and then puts that new little gem in the right place. My favorite thing that kind of shows how this works is anybody who is a level 1 teacher, you know where I'm at with this. Even if you don't teach Spanish, you probably know that this is wrong. Your students, on the first few days of class, they know how to say me llamo. They do it so well. They do it beautifully. And then as soon as you write it on the board, you know what I'm talking about. As soon as you write me llamo on the board and teach them how it's spelled, they go, me llamo. Oh, that's so cool. I can't wait to memorize that. I can't wait to figure that out and use it every day. And they start saying me llamo, and you're like, where did this come from? I didn't teach you that. I said me llamo like at least 40 times. Processing, re-putting it back together, and then it'll come on the way out as perfect. Or what happens more often than not is that they start to say me llamo es, or even me llamo es. I've heard that, and it's funny. But the reason why I don't correct them on it is because I know that their powerful brains are processing it. So I say, me llamo es, I hear it and I go, oh, tú te llamas. I give them some other feedback to go with it, more input. I don't correct. And the reason why is because I know that their brain is processing it, and what they need is more input. They don't need correction, they need more input. So that's probably my favorite one. Now let me know, what did you think? Did any of those myths surprise you? The first one is that teachers, parents, adults, caregivers teach us language. Not true. Language is a skill, not a subject. Myth number 2, that is indeed true. Language is a skill, it is not a subject. Myth number 3, certain languages are harder than others. Whoa! Definitely not true. And myth number 4 is that writing systems are a separate piece and exist on their own independently of spoken language. That one was true. And then the last one, number 5, is that errors in language are bad and we need to correct them. You know better now, so you're not going to do this anymore. So now that you know what the 5 myths are, I'm going to blow your mind here and tell you that there's 9 of them. There's 9. So if you're ready to see what the rest of them are and have your language learning myth busted a little bit, grab the link that's below that says free guide, World Language Teacher Toolkit. It's over 20 pages of glorious information, but on there, you're going to see this. And you're going to see, those are the ones we already went over. And then you're going to see even more. We got 9 in total. So thank you so much for joining me on this little game and playing with me on whether you think it's true or false. And I will see you. Shoot me an email after you get that toolkit and tell me which one surprised you the most now that you know them all. Saludos.